Hello, my name is Xander. Welcome back to the Docker Compose and Django tutorial series. In this tutorial, we're going to have a look at how to build and start a Django project with a Postgres or MySQL database. So you can follow from this tutorial. You don't have to watch part 1 and 2. It would obviously be useful because I will presume that you do have some understanding of some of the basic commands that we've already covered. Apart from that, obviously you're going to need Docker, Docker Compose, Python, and a code editor if you want to follow along. In this tutorial, we're going to create a new Docker Compose file. Well, we're going to just extend from the previous tutorial our Docker Compose file to include a new service that's going to be Postgres or MySQL. We'll cover both of these installations in this tutorial. So we will then go ahead and build a new Docker image and container, and then I'll also show you how to remote into a Docker container so you can run commands in the container. So I've gone ahead and downloaded the previous tutorial's code, and I've updated the commands text. So part 3 here, that's where we are. We're going to be utilizing these commands, and you can see they're very similar to the previous commands that we've been utilizing, but this is just a record of all the commands that we've utilized so far. So let's start off by configuring a Postgres database for a Django application. So we are starting here with an application. So let's just go ahead and delete the existing application, and we don't need this database anymore, and we won't need this manage file. So we'll build this automatically through Docker Compose. So I've got the command text, a requirements text, and the Docker file and the Docker Compose file. Okay, so first of all, let's go into the requirements file. So because we're going to be utilizing a Postgres database, we're going to need instructions, or Django is going to need instructions in order to connect to it and to work with a Postgres database. So we're going to need a new package. So go ahead and add the new package here. So like I said, this is basically the package that's going to allow that connectivity or provide the instructions to connect to a Postgres database in Django or with Django. Okay, so now we've got that, we can close the requirements. That's going to be installed when we run or build the image. So now we can focus on the Docker Compose file. So far in the previous tutorial, we set up one application, which was Django. So the whole point here really with Docker Compose is that we can compose many applications. So now we want to run a database. So we can go ahead and now describe a new service. All of the images come from the official Docker Hub service. So here, for example, you'll find the Postgres and MySQL official image. So that's what we're going to be pulling down and utilizing in this tutorial. Now, with every image, there are instructions, and it provides other references to other commands or parameters that you can, or variables, sorry, that you can define within your Docker Compose file. So if you are looking for a more advanced setup, here I'm just going to show you a basic get started Docker Compose configuration, but by all means have a look in here and have a look at some of the more advanced options. A minimal configuration would look like this for Postgres. The image, Postgres. The volume. So here we want to map across the data from the database over to our local machine. So we're going to create a new folder on our local machine, data db. That's going to happen automatically, and we're going to map across from the var.lib PostgreSQL or PostgreSQL, data folder over on our container. So that's going to map it across. All our data is going to reside here. That means obviously when we close the container or remove the container, our data will persist in our local storage. Right, so next up is some environment variables. So the Postgres database name, the user, and the password. So we need to match that across to our settings in a minute in Django. So just remember that. And then I'm going to name the container PostgresDB. And that's pretty much it there for kind of a basic setup for Postgres. So as I dropped in there, let's just close everything here. We don't need that. In a minute, when we build this, we are going to need to configure Django for Postgres database. But the first thing we can do now is obviously build our image, start our container, and then our application will be available for us to then configure it with the database settings. Now, you may already have a Django application. So you can work in that way if you want to. So if you have a Django application, you can follow this guide. Of course, that's not a problem at all. You'll just need to now change that settings, and I'll show you how to do that in a second. So now we can build an image. So if you head over to the commands, if you're not familiar, let's do docker compose build. So we're going to build the image. So let that do its thing. If you are using the Docker desktop, you'll be able to see the image being created. Let's just get rid of all the other images, etc. that I have. Let's just remove that. So here we're building the app image. So I've just gone ahead and we've built that. Yep, that's already built now. So that was called app. So now we can go ahead and run this command here. So remember from the previous tutorial, docker compose run. Here we're going to remove the container that gets started, because we're going to run this from docker compose up. So here I'm just purposefully going through as many commands as I can to make you aware of the different commands that are available. So there are differences here, and later on in the tutorial series we'll probably cut down on commands we utilize, because we can perform similar actions with different commands. So here we're going to run the run, and then we're going to remove the container that is generated. So we define the app we want to utilize, or sorry, the image, sorry, we want to utilize. And here we are going to run a one-time command, which is going to be Django admin start project core. So that's going to create a new project. Our new folder is going to appear here, or linked across to our container for both the database and our application. So let's give that a go. So that's going to take a couple of seconds, and there we go. So yours is going to take a little bit longer. I've already have the Postgres image. You can see it's 300 meg in size. So that happens almost instantly. So here you can see I've got the core. Now, one thing that wasn't made, creating network B default with a default driver. Okay, so one thing that didn't happen there, I was expecting the volume to appear. Now let's have a look at the reason why that is. So you can see that I've run this file and I'm missing a command. So the missing command. So this is going to be depends on. So you can see there that this didn't run. So if I now add the command depends on and describe what this depends on, db, now this is going to be also connected and set up. So depends on is a command in actual fact that really just defines the running order, the startup and close down order. So now we've got that in place, let's do this again. So I'm going to go through the process again. We don't have a container, so let's get rid of this image. So we don't need to do this. I just want to show you from scratch again, so we're all working on the same page. So let's go ahead and docker compose build. So let's build our image again. So that shouldn't take long. So let's run this command again. So this time, with that additional command, you can now see we have the data folder and the core folder. So this is our database data and our normal Django application. So I did receive an error here. That's because I've already created, I'm trying to run the command again for the same, to build the same app. It already exists. So that's not a problem at all. So that's why I'm being shown that message there. You might not be. So now we have that in place. What we can now do is go into settings. You may already be familiar with this. Go down to the database configuration. And of course, we don't need that anymore. That's the old database configuration for SQLite. And now we need to add our Postgres configuration. So remembering the settings from the Docker Compose, the name, username, and password was Postgres. The host is DB. So that just basically describes the service here, DB, and then the port number, the default port number for Postgres database. Right, so with that in place, that now connects or attaches our Django project to the database. So we can go ahead and run compose up. So going back to our commands here, so we're going to run docker compose up. So that's going to start the container with our configurations. You can see that our database has started, and then now Django has then started. So you can now see the running order the database is started first and then Django. So you can see it now tells us that we need to run our unapplied migrations, and that's going to be our real test whether this is working, because if we can apply the migrations, it means we're connected to our database, because this is the only database that's described in our settings. Right, so now let's make a new terminal window. So let's run the exec command. So basically docker exec, that's a command that's basically saying run a command in one of your containers, exec. So what we're going to do is we're going to create this interactive terminal mode using the flags int. And then we need to describe the app that we want, sorry, the container that we want to move into. So we called this in actual fact Django container. So let's go into the Django container and we're going to run a command. So that command is going to be bin bash. So we're going to start a bash shell, and that essentially is going to allow us then to interact with it here within the terminal. So we'll be able to use the command line of that container here. So let's have a look. There we go. So now we're inside of the container, so we can run our normal command. So let's have a look at what version of Python it's running. 3.8.8. There we go. So ls for listing all the files. So I'm currently in my project folder. That's the /Django folder there. So I can move to the default or the root directory and so on. So this is just Linux, if you're familiar with Linux. So now I can go ahead and run my manage file. And then I can migrate. So that's obviously going to test. You can see that all the databases tables are created and it looks like I'm connected. So from this point, I can carry on and continue working on my project. So to confirm, you can test this yourself. It's always good to do that. But if you were to close down your containers and your image and start this again, all the data will be persisting here within your local storage. Remember, this project, in my case, is on my desktop on my local hard drive. So now let's take a look at changing this into a MySQL database. Right, so first of all, we'll just comment out all the Postgres. So we're inside the Docker Compose first. So we're going to need a configuration now for MySQL. So let's just paste one in and have a look. So here I'm running an older version of MySQL because by default, a latest version, there's a few errors that needs resolving by default. So here I'm just running, just to show you, get this working, the MySQL 5.7. So I'm defining here the database name, and there are other settings, as you might imagine. MySQL allow empty passwords true. So by default, like I haven't said before, by default, the MySQL database has a username of root and a password which is empty. So we can apply this setting if we want to, allow empty passwords if we want, or we could create some more passwords and usernames. So again, have a look at the Docker Hub image, the MySQL image, and then it will detail all of the different environment variables that you can set. So again, we're just setting up our volume to mirror across our data. So this time I'm going to make a new folder called MySQL DB, and that's going to copy across, or it's going to mirror the folder on my container varlib MySQL. So again, this is going to make sure that all the data about my database that's needed if I were to restart the container is contained on my local storage database. Right, so that's the Docker Compose file. So as you might imagine, now we're going to need to change our database configuration in our Django setting. So let's go ahead and do that. So it's a very similar setup as you might imagine. So here we've got MySQL backend now. The name of the database, that's mirrored across from the Docker Compose. We've got the username, password of nothing, host DB, port 3306. So that's that done. So now, in no particular order, of course, let's have a look at the requirements. So here we're going to need to have, again, a way of connecting to the database. So where this is the instructions to connect to a Postgres, we're now going to include MySQL client, which again is the package that we're going to need to connect Django or allow Django to communicate with our database, and vice versa. Right, so that's in place. So we've got now our Docker Compose file sorted, settings in our Django, and our requirements. So the last step is to go to the Docker file. So here we've been using the slim version of Python 3.8 image, the official Python image. So this isn't going to work. So we aren't going to be able to install by default MySQL client directly onto the Slim Buster. So we're just going to be using 3.8, and that is a very large image. It's around about 800 to 900 meg. So that's a change that I need to make there. So now I can go ahead. Let's just close that down. Let's open up a new terminal. Right, so let's just go ahead and just stop all of the containers. So we can do this with the desktop tool, or of course we can do it via commands. So I'm just going to remove the image and let's go back. Right, so let's go ahead now and Docker Compose build. So let's do that first for no particular reason other just to show you from the very beginning. So that's now built. Now we already have a project here, so but I'll just run the full command again. So what we're going to see is a new folder appear in the data area. Let's go ahead and run that. So now you can see we've got the MySQL folder. Again, I've got this error because obviously my project already exists. So it's just me being a little bit lazy there for you. Okay, so now we can compose up. So let's get this going. To build our containers, all the services are running and it looks like we're going to need to migrate. So let's open up our, let's get rid of that. Okay, so let's now open up a new terminal. We can obviously now move into our container like we've done before. Now that's the wrong container, so it should be Django container. And now we're in the terminal. Let's do exactly the same thing again. Manage by and migrate. And there we go. So we're now migrating the default tables from the installed apps, and it looks like we're now connected to a MySQL database. So same situation here, all the data is now being mirrored across to this folder. So if we were to close the container, restart the image, for example, or completely uninstall Docker and install it again, everything is persisting here on our local storage. So there we have a baseline installation for Postgres and MySQL. Now, we don't need to run Django, for example. This is very flexible. We don't need to run Django in Docker container, for example. You may want to develop your Django application within your local machine like you normally do. But hopefully you're seeing the benefit now of using Docker for installing other services such as Postgres, your database, or any other message broker, for example, that you might want to attach to your application. Maybe you're using Node, for example, so we don't need to install it anymore on our operating systems, which for some software can be a real pain to set up, particularly in Windows. So it's very flexible. Later on in your project, you might then migrate your Django application to Docker before you then deploy it, of course. Obviously, there's multiple options here. And as time goes by, hopefully you become more familiar with the commands. It just become natural for you to utilize Docker, maybe, in your workflow. So thank you very much again. Hopefully this was useful. If you do like it, then please like and subscribe. And hopefully I'll see you in the next tutorial.